Thank you very much for allowing me to do this. I think it's a wise thing to recognize the history behind our nation, and with next couple of days it's the 4th of July, and so I like to read this. And real quick before I do a couple of prayer requests, there was a couple of situations the past couple of days where one police officer in San Antonio, Texas two police officers were shot, one was killed by an armed suspect, and then 5 more Dallas police officers were assassinated within the past week. So if you pray for the police departments and their families, please. So there was a lawyer once. His name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a story that I'm sure you're aware of. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the national anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game, we stand in our church services, and we sing the words to that song, and they float over our minds, and we don't even realize what we are singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protagonists of it, it had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The Americans had prisoners and the British had prisoners. The American government initiated a move. They went to the British and said, "Let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners." The Americans said, "We want to send a man to discuss this with you." The British were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. The Americans said, "We want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He is going to come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange." At an appointed day, he went out in a rowboat to this boat to try to negotiate with the British officials. They reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant that he had been successful, went down below in the boat, and what he found was a cargo hold full of humanities men. He said, "Men, I've got news for you tonight. You're free. Tonight I have negotiated successfully your return to the colonies. You'll be taken out of this boat, out of this filth, out of these chains." As he went back on board to arrange for their passage to the shore, the admiral came to him and said, "We have a slight problem. We will still honor our commitment to release these men, but it will be merely academic after tonight. It won't matter." Francis Scott Key said, "Well, what do you mean?" The admiral said, "Well, Mr. Key, you see, tonight we have laid an ultimatum upon the colonies. Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or, you see that fort right over there, Fort Henry? We are going to remove it from the face of the earth." He said, "How are you going to do that?" The admiral said, "If you will, scan the horizon of the sea." As Francis Scott Key looked, he could see hundreds of little dots. The admiral said, "That is the entire British war fleet. All of the gunpowder, all of the armament is being called upon to demolish that fort. It will be here within striking distance in about 2.5 hours. The war is over. These men would be free anyway." Francis Scott Key said, "You can't shell that fort. That's a large fort full of women and children. It's predominantly not a military fort." The admiral said, "Don't worry about it. We've let them a way out." Francis Scott Key said, "Well, what's that?" The admiral said, "Do you see that flag way up on the rampart? We have told them if they will lower that flag, the shelling will stop immediately. We will know that they have surrendered, and you will now be under British rule." Francis Scott Key went down below and told the men what was about to happen. They asked, "How many ships?" He replied, "Hundreds." The ships got closer, and Francis Scott Key went back on top and told the men that he would shout down and tell them what's going on as he watched. As twilight began to fall, and as the haze hung over the ocean, as the sun set, suddenly the British war fleet unleashed. Bang! The sound was deafening. There were so many guns and no reliefs. It was absolutely impossible to talk or hear. The sky, although dark, was suddenly lit. From down below, all you could hear the prisoners saying was, "Tell us where the flag is. What have they done with the flag? Is the flag still flying over the rampart? Tell us." 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours into the shelling, every time the bomb would explode close to the flag, and you would see the flag illuminated in the red glare of that bomb, Francis Scott Key would report down to the men below, "It's still up! It's not down!" The admiral came and said, "Your people are insane! What's the matter with them? Don't they understand that this is an impossible situation?" Francis Scott Key remembered what George Washington said, "The thing that sets American Christians, that the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is that he will die on his feet before he will live on his knees." The admiral said, "We have now instructed all of the guns to be focused on the rampart to take that flag down. We don't understand something. Our reconnaissance tells us that we have hit that flag directly again, and again, and it's still flying. We don't understand that. However, now we are going to bring every gun on that point for the next 3 hours." The barrage was unmerciful. All that he could hear was the men down below praying. The prayer, "God, keep that flag flying where we last saw it." Sunrise came, and there was a heavy mist laying over the land. However, the rampart was tall enough that there stood the flag completely nondescript in shreds. The flagpole itself was at a crazy angle, but the flag was still at the top.
Yeah, glory to God. Thank Christ.
Francis Scott Key went aboard and immediately went into Fort Henry to see what had happened. What he found had happened was that the flagpole and that flag had suffered repetitious direct hits. And when it had fallen, men and fathers who knew what it meant for that flag to be on the ground, although knowing that all of the British guns were trained on it, walked over and held it up humanly until they died. Their bodies were removed and others took their place. Francis Scott Key said, "What held that flag in place were patriots' bodies." He penned the song, "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, o'er the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. The debt was demanded, the price was paid."
Hallelujah.
Thank you, Brother Caleb.